And my obsessive thoughts were like something as trivial as like taking complimentary candy from a bowl and then like thinking like, oh my gosh, did I just steal that? Like, is somebody going to come after me for taking this candy? To something as big as like thinking that the leaders of my church were false prophets, and like the thought just popped into my head, and then like that was it. I thought about that for like, a really long time, and I shared these feelings with friends and family members and spiritual mentors, and there was never like any evidence for the things I was thinking, but I just couldn't make them go away. Like no matter what, they were just racing through my head. And that may sound stupid, and a lot of them were really stupid. But that didn't stop them from playing on repeat in my head. So eventually I was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder, but it was 2 years before I found a medication that worked for me. In those 2 years, I would frequently have passing thoughts about how nice it would be to be dead, just to get away from the pain. And my other escapist ideation was to get on my bike and just like ride away and never come back to anything I knew. And during this phase, I definitely had intellectual doubts about God and his plan. It didn't seem like a very good plan, and I had no idea what he was doing. But I think the thing that saved me was that I just talked to God about that. This was a habit I had already built into my life, and I can't emphasize like how important that is to have, because it'll really come into play, in some of your darkest times. So I would just spend time with him, just crying out, like literally, like I would cry and just ask him what he was doing. And Jesus modeled this very behavior in the final hours of his life. In the garden, we see him ask God to take away his suffering, but also say, "Thy will be done." And on the cross, we hear him say, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," or my God, why have you forsaken me?" God didn't reveal to me what he was doing, but I knew that giving up would be the wrong thing to do. I'd spent enough time following God to have some experiences that gave me at least some confidence that he would come through for me. It was not without doubt, as I was not 100% certain I was right, but I continually made the decision to stick to the path I was already on. This is the biblical vision of doubt. Bring your fears, doubts, and worries to God, as Christians have done for thousands of years, and then take a leap of faith. That is what James is calling us to do. He's not saying anything about somebody who's trying to figure out what they think about Jesus and like if he's trustworthy, like somebody who's not a Christian yet. He's talking to people that are already committed to following Jesus and telling them to hang on. Now, this is advice that really anybody could give. You don't have to be a Christian to believe that sticking something out to the end is a good idea. So what makes this book unique? Why not include some of Plato's wisdom about life, since it probably wouldn't be that different? And that's where my final truth comes in. Christian faith is rooted in the historical reality of what God has done and the promises he has made. Everything regarding the wisdom proposed in James is based on the character of God and what he's done in Jesus, namely his death and resurrection. The fact that Jesus is raised from the dead is presupposed, and if it wasn't, the advice being given would be terrible advice. Why would anyone ever be joyful while suffering? The only reason to be joyful while suffering is if you think you're on the right side of a battle. Because you know in the end you will be vindicated, that truth will defeat lies, that reality will defeat illusion, and that light will defeat darkness. So here we are again, back at doubt. How do we know that we can trust God? The Christian answer is because of Jesus' death and resurrection. His resurrection vindicates everything he spoke to his disciples, making his claims about himself and God completely true. This is the reality of our situation, and like John was saying, it's a crazy thing to believe in. It's a hard thing to believe. And I think that we've heard it so often as Christians that we're kind of numb to the reality of how bizarre this is. Yeah, as Christians, we proclaim a man claiming to be God, died, was buried, and then came back to life 3 days later. But this is what we believe. The resurrection was a historical event. That's what the New Testament writers believed, and that's what I believe. So where does that leave us? It kind of depends where you're at this point. Do you have trouble believing in something like the resurrection? If you do, I think that's an okay place to be. Jesus said it's good to know what you're getting into before you commit to following him. I would challenge you to read any number of books that have been written in defense of the subject. But let me go ahead and just say a couple of things about the resurrection that at least make putting it aside as myth very difficult. What the disciples did by saying Jesus was resurrected was vindicate all the claims that Jesus made about himself. Jesus equated himself to God, and the early church firmly believed that he was God. And this amounted to blasphemy in Judaism. These guys were deeply religious. Why would they come up with something like this? Where would they get the idea of a crucified servant God? No other religion has something like this idea. Who would come up with the idea that the most intimate and true picture of God is Jesus on the cross? It's an incredibly scandalous claim and almost shameful. We wear a cross on our neck like it's like a badge of honor, but it's like wearing an electric chair on your neck, basically. So why would they proclaim this and be so sure to go to their deaths for it? And then the second observation I would ask you to consider is about the women who followed Jesus. In the ancient world, women were not considered reliable witnesses or thought of very highly. Yet in all 4 gospel accounts, they are recorded as being the first witnesses to the risen Lord. This is especially amazing considering how many seeming inconsistencies the gospel accounts have about the resurrection. Why would all 4 authors have included this data? My point here is there's a lot of historical data that is worth considering. For those of you who do believe that Jesus is resurrected, I have a different message. I've already touched on some of the repercussions of what the good news that Jesus has been raised means for us. It means we have literally nothing to fear. And I think we probably all know that as Christians. What I'm more concerned about is why this doesn't often feel like a reality. And I think we wrongly assume that knowing the cognitive truth about something, like the resurrection, will instantly make us stress-free. But knowing something intellectually is very different than having a lived experience. Let me give an example from my friend Henry Nouwen. He was a contemporary Christian author who died about 30 years ago. He was a college professor in his early years and often wrote about the problems of loneliness in our modern society. If you read his early books, you can tell that he understood what he was talking about on a cognitive level. But it wasn't until the end of his life, when he went through his own period of intense doubt and loneliness, that really became embedded in his heart. And you can really tell just in the last writings that he has. My point in saying this is don't get stressed out by the fact that you don't live in a way that is perfectly conformed to the reality of our situation. We're all on a journey, and God has made us embodied beings who grow and change. Even Jesus, on the final night before his crucifixion, asked for the burden to be taken from him. I've got a quote from a book called The Different Drum that I've kind of paraphrased. So let me read that. There are few among us who do not have great difficulty not knowing things about ourselves, the past, the present, and the future. The question I most often get from my students is, how can we truly know that we are doing the right thing? I must reply that there is no such formula, and I speak once again of Jesus. He, like all of us, had 2 different parts of his mind, a divine part and a human part. In his divine part, he seemed to know not only that he would be crucified, but also that he would be resurrected on the 3rd day, and that the church would grow out of this event and change the world. But in the human part of his mind, he did not seem to know that at all. This is the Jesus who sweated blood in the Garden of Gethsemane. There was a moment of decision when he didn't know what would happen. Had he known beyond any shadow of a doubt, with 100% certainty, that he would be resurrected on the third day, and that the church would flourish, and hundreds of millions of us would worship in his name, then going to the cross would have been a smart investment, nothing more. 3 to 6 hours of agony would be a small price to pay for that 100% guaranteed glory. But it was precisely because he did not know, because he threw his being into the arms of the mysterious God he loved, that his sacrifice lay. Our bodies have been made by God, and he has called them good. God is a God of process. He is a teacher, and he has created us to grow spiritually in his school of ministry. Keep learning what it means to be an embodied being who follows Jesus, and don't get hung up on the fact that you aren't perfectly spiritual yet. Joel, can you put up the final picture? A few years ago, I was pushing my bike up a mountain in Colorado, and God spoke to me. We had been walking for hours, going up through the tree line. We were on a gravel road with cars occasionally passing by, throwing up dust. The rain had come, and for a while forced us to hide out under a bridge. It was the final day of our week-long trip, and we were tired. We finally broke through the tree line, and as we turned around, the view took my breath away. I realized how far I had come, and that a great distance had been traversed by thousands of small steps. This is the vision that God has for us when we push through hard times. And what's really interesting is that Amy and I were walking to our mailbox a couple weeks ago, and she was reflecting on her own struggles of this past year, and went on to explain the exact same thing in almost the exact same verbiage. Just saying that she felt like she was finally getting her first glimpse of this beautiful mountain scene. I think that's a great way to think about the book of James. This is where the words of James find us. Not in the library mulling over intellectual concepts, but on the mountainside somewhere amidst thousands of steps as we trudge towards the peak, wondering if we're crazy. And James calls out to us, keep going. You've not far now. Keep putting one foot in front of the other, for the God in which you trust will not falter. He is a strong mountain, and he has a beautiful view waiting in store for you. Come and see.